Hello and welcome to part 12 of my video series on how to use Blender 2.7. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to add image textures to objects in Blender, as well as how to add bump maps. And let's go ahead and get started by clicking on the splash screen. I'm not going to be using this cube for this video. I'm going to be using a flat square plane instead. So I'm going to go ahead with my 3D cursor in the middle of the scene. You press Shift-C to center it. I'm going to add a plane, and we're going to scale it up with the S key to whatever size you feel comfortable. Now we're going to be adding an image texture to this plane. We're actually going to add kind of like a very deserty sort of a ground image, and I'm finding this image, where I found it at a website called cgtextures.com. Now this is an awesome resource for any 3D artists when you're looking for textures that you're allowed to use in your own productions. If you just do a Google image search and find a textured image, chances are somebody owns the right to that image. But this website, cgtextures.com, has images that you can use royalty free. Now you have to sign up with a membership for it. Membership is free for the base membership, but you can also pay to get higher resolution images as well. What I've done is I've just gone ahead and gone to the soil category and the cracked soil category, and as you can see, they have a lot to choose from. I just picked one of the first ones I saw. The thing that you should look out for when you're finding images for texturing, especially in 3D, is tiled images, because what happens is if you repeat this square over and over again next to each other, you want them to tile nicely. That means the cracks will all line up when you add more than one of these squares next to each other. So what I did was I clicked on this thumbnail. It gives you multiple versions. Some are tiled, some are not. And this one has the little tiled word above it, so I downloaded this one. If you want to get this image as well, I'll provide a link to it in the description below this video, and I just have saved that image file, which is, I believe, a JPEG or a PNG, to my desktop. We're going to go ahead and add a material to this flat plane, but I'm not going to use this materials tab. I'm going to use entirely nodes, because I want you to get used to using nodes instead of just using this area here. So I'm going to split this window into two, top and bottom, and I'm going to change this top window to a nodes editor. But before I do that though, I'm going to split it again in half, and I'm going to leave this window as a kind of a normal solid shaded 3D viewport, and I'm going to change the bottom 3D viewport to a rendered viewport or viewport shading. Let's go ahead and change this top window though into a node editor, and by default it has the side panel. I don't need it. In fact, I'm going to get rid of this side panel as well. Again, we can always click the plus to get it back, but we don't mind. Now normally when I add a new material to an object, in this case the plane, I would click on new. Again, I'm going to try to avoid using this section entirely, so I'm going to go with this object selected in the nodes editor. Now there are different kinds of nodes. I should be on the material node and then the object node right here, but that's how it is by default. And I'm just going to click new. That'll add a new material. You can see it over here, and I can name it. So I'm going to call this cracked soil. And you can see from my nodes that I have a diffuse shader and I have a material output. Now, before I go any further, I'm actually going to turn up my light and change it to a area light. So with the light selected, I'm going to click on area. And in the last video, I talked about lighting and rendering. So I talked about what the difference is between at least point, sun, and area lights. And I want a square area light, and I want it to be, let's say, 5 Blender units. And I'm going to use nodes with that lamp. There they are, and I'll turn the strength up to, let's say, 300, maybe even more than that, maybe even 500. Okay, back to the plane. Right now we have just a diffuse shader on it, but I don't want that. In fact, I'm going to make this window a little bit bigger, just because we don't need to see this one. It's only for selecting objects. And so I'm going to change that this shader to a mix shader. So I'm going to delete that one. And I'm going to go Shift A and add a new shader. I'm going to add a mix shader because I want the ground to be a little bit shiny and also have an image texture on it below the shininess of it. So a mix shader will let us do that. It lets you plug in a glossy shader and a diffuse or matte shader, but I'm going to connect these two, the surface to the surface. And we're going to add 2 more shaders. So I'll add my diffuse shader. That's where we're going to be adding the texture, the image that we're using, that cracked soil ground texture. So I'm going to add in or connect the diffuse shader to the bottom slot here, and I'm going to Shift A and add a glossy shader. These are the 3 most common shaders that you'll use to texture objects, because normally a texture or a surface would be both a little bit shiny or have some reflectivity whatsoever, and then it would have some color or an image. So that's what it looks like so far. I can turn the roughness down or up. It doesn't really matter too much. I can affect the factor of how the 2 mix together. I'm going to turn it down so it's mostly, and I think that's what it'll be, mostly diffuse if we turn this down, I believe. Let's just go ahead and give it a color just for fun. No, it's the other way around. The color, the one on the bottom, is entirely prevalent if this is turned up to 1. Okay, so how do we now add an image? Well, that's what this color is for. Believe it or not, you can pick a color, or using this input next to color, you can provide an image. That's what this little yellow circle means. These little circles, the inputs and outputs, are color-coded. Green typically means a shader. Gray usually means a black and white image. This bluey purple color normally means a math vector or a normal map, which we'll talk about in a future video. And yellow usually means a colored image. So what I can do is I can add a new node that's going to let me add an image. And that's going to be found under the texture category from your add menu. So Shift A and texture, image texture. And that adds an image texture node, which I can then use to open a file on my computer. So I'm going to connect these 2 nodes. So now the color of the diffuse material on my plane will be expecting an image. And because there is no image, the sort of the default color in Blender, and it's been this way for a long time, is just purple. I'm not sure why. But now I can go ahead and open an image on my computer. So I'm going to go to my desktop and soil cracked 00867S. That's the file that I downloaded from cdtextures.com. And it didn't work. Well, here's the thing. I'm going to disconnect this color from this image texture just by dragging that away. And you'll see that that green color came back. But when I connect the image to the diffuse or just the normal color of the plane, it does change color. In fact, it is a very similar color to the overall color that's on the that soil, cracked soil texture right here. So what's going on? Well, the image is actually on the plane, but the plane doesn't know how to tile or place the image on the plane. And that's because the default way that Blender expects you to add images to an object or a mesh is by using what's called UV mapping. And UV mapping is a great, really intricate way of being able to tell a texture where to be placed on an object, but that's going to be in the next video in this series. The easiest way to put an image onto an object, especially a flat plane, is just to use what's called generated coordinates, which kind of lets you, or Blender, very easily put the image on the shape or mesh. The way we do that is we have to define this vector. Now, vector again means math coordinate or mathematical coordinate system. That's just how I would explain it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell the image texture to have a vector, a coordinate system, by adding another node. Yes, our nodes are getting pretty complicated here, and they will be quite complicated at the end of this video, but I'm trying to explain it as best as I can. So I'm going to add a new node, and I believe, and I usually have a hard time finding this, it's going to be, I believe, under input and texture coordinate. Yes, that is it. So the texture coordinate lets you pick normal, which would be from normal mapping, which kind of means like folding out an object flat into the UV image editor window in Blender, and we'll talk about that in the next video. But we want to have just generated coordinates. So I'm going to connect these two, and notice it's purple to purple, and we have our image texture on the image. What I'm going to do just very briefly is make this window full screen by putting my mouse cursor in there and pressing Control up arrow on my keyboard so you can see those nodes in that pattern in all their glory. So if you need to pause the video now and do this in your own copy of Blender, go ahead and do that now. But we're going to quickly move on. The way that we would customize how this texture is actually laid out on this square, because right now it just sort of took the whole square image from our computer and it placed it on this square. But what if I want to take advantage of the fact that this texture is tiled? I want maybe all these cracks and all these little sections to be a lot smaller and for it to be, you know, a much larger plane with much smaller copies of this pattern. Well, what I would have to do is add in a new node which lets me scale down how many times or scale up how many times this texture is repeated on this object. So what I'm going to do is in between where we've said the coordinates are generated and the image texture, we're going to add in a node right here. So that sort of interrupts the flow. It says, yes, we're using generated coordinates, and yes, we're having an image texture, but before we tell the image texture that the coordinates are generated, we're going to say scale it up or down depending on what we want, X number of times. So I'm going to add in a new node, and I believe it's going to be called, let me quickly try to see if I can get this. I think it's called mapping. So I'm going to add a mapping node, and of course if I just drag this node onto one of these noodles, you'll see it turns orange. That means it'll get placed in the middle of that noodle and it'll be connected all nicely. So now we've told our coordinate of our texture that it's generated, but now we can go in here, and I'm going to zoom in on this. We can tell it what scale we want it to be, and notice there is X, Y, and Z for scale, and we can even change the rotation. So if I change the Z rotation, you'll notice that and I'm going to change it by 90 degrees, that the texture rotates. Yes, I can rotate it, and you're not seeing it very well because it's going very fast, but it is rotating. That's because we want to spin it as if there's a pole going through the Z-axis, but I want to scale it up, so I'm going to change this to maybe 3 and 3 and 3, and now we have that tiled texture all over this, and it is now 3 by 3, so it's 9 copies of itself. I can zoom in on it, and it looks pretty good, but what about that whole glossiness thing? So I'm going to go back and I'm going to kind of adjust this lamp and adjust my nodes so that you can see a little bit more glossiness on this surface. So right now the factor of the glossiness versus the diffuse is 1. That means there's almost no glossiness. I'm going to turn that down. So now you're going to see more glossiness happening on the surface. In fact, maybe I'll set it to 0.5. I'm sorry if that's very small on your screen. But now what's happening is this glossiness is glossing over all of those cracks, and that doesn't look very good. We can improve the way it looks by changing this color to something that's more like the color of the surface. So maybe I'll make it a little bit brown or yellowy orange, and then make it a darker yellowy orange so that it's a little bit better, but this still looks washed out. What we can do now, or what I want to show you now, is how to make this texture have a bump map. Now a bump map doesn't actually make the surface bumpy. It doesn't actually displace or add new geometry onto this texture, but what it can do is let you take an image texture and define sort of artificial up and down points on a flat surface that the light in the scene, your lamp, will interact with. So it sort of fakes bumpy geometry, it fakes bumpiness. Now we don't want just a bunch of little bumps, we want it to follow the bumpiness or the grooves that are on this texture. So we're going to use the same image texture with the same coordinates that we've set up already for the diffuse map, but we're going to make these 3 same nodes give us our bumpiness. Now where do you add bumpiness in here? Well, in cycles, bumpiness or bump maps are actually called displacement, and that is sort of a misleading term. If you're familiar with the displacement modifier in Blender, you'll know that the displacement modifier actually does change the geometry of your mesh, but in cycles in the materials, displacement just means bumps or bump maps. And if you know what this gray dot means, it means that it's actually expecting a black and white or grayscale image, an image file. And you can use a colored image file too. In fact, that's what we'll be doing. But if you actually want to really control what that looked like, you can actually make a new version of this texture in black and white, and then total black would be totally far down on a bump scale, and total white in a black and white image would be all the way up. So that's how you define up and down in bumpiness. We're not going to make a second image though, we're just going to use these same 3 nodes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the color output of the image texture, and I'm just going to drag it and connect it with the displacement of our material output. And you'll see immediately you get a huge change. It looks very, very bumpy now. And that might be okay, but it's probably a little bit too much. This is a very exaggerated bumpiness. You know, it's okay because maybe this is what you want, but if you're doing something more subtle, like a brick texture or just the bumpiness on each individual brick, or you're making something like a wood texture or wood grain, you wouldn't want this to be that bumpy. How you can scale this down, and you guessed it, is going to be using nodes. So I've just sort of been moving these around a little bit. Yes, you can sort of get a complicated and very kind of overlapping nodes and node noodles, but between the image texture output, the color of the image, and the displacement, we want to adjust it in this path here. So I'm going to be adding a new node, and the node I'm going to be adding, so I'm going to go to add, is in the color section, and it's called Mix RGB. If you're familiar with blending layers in either GIMP or Photoshop, how you can blend 2 layers together using things like mix or add or darken or multiply, it's the same sort of idea here. So I'm going to take this mix shader and drag it into that noodle so it connects on the input and output of the mix shader. You'll notice an immediate difference, or you might. Let's go ahead and actually disconnect this again so you'll see if it changes. The way you can disconnect a node so that it connects the way it used to be is if you have a node selected and you go down to the node menu, you can select, let me find the right one, detach links. There is no keyboard shortcut, but detach links will make it the way that it was. It'll see what the inputs and outputs are and just sort of connect the old ones again. So this is what it looked like before. I'm going to drag this over there and we're going to see if it changed at all. It changed a little bit, but what I want to do now is use this node to adjust the up and down, the amount of bump. What I have to do now is change mix to multiply. That's one of the many different sorts of modes like dodge and overlay and lighten and darken. Multiply is technically the best way of doing it. I'm not very good at explaining why that is. Once I get into maybe talking more in Photoshop in this video series, or maybe a Photoshop video series, I'll cover that in more detail. But now I can change the factor here. So I think I need to actually drag this connector down to color 2, and now I can change the factor of the bumpiness. I believe that factor of 0 will be no bump at all. That looks very, very flat to me. And a factor of 1 will be really, really bumpy. So maybe I'll go somewhere in between just to get a little bit of bumpiness. Because if you get up close, you'll want to see some bumpiness there, but not too much. And this totally depends on the amount that you need. And you can type in a value. Maybe I'll just go to 0.7 for bumpiness. So that's how you add bump maps. You have to use the displacement, and you can either use the image that you already have, or you could even bring in a new image texture if the bumpiness doesn't match up with the image that's already on the diffuse texture of the mesh. Now, we could leave it at this, but one thing I notice is that the shininess of the surface is still going into these cracks. So if I just look at the image texture, so I'm going to actually turn off my displacement for a second. I'm just going to hold Control and slice through with my left mouse button that noodle. These grooves, no matter if they're bumped or not, they're still going to have glossiness in this sort of cracked or the dark area, the grout area, or the mud area of these cracks. I don't want that part to be glossy. I want it to be quite matte. So if I connect these two again to give our bump back to the texture, you can see that there is glossiness in there. It's not totally black. It's getting shininess or glossiness from that glossy texture. What I want to do is define this roughness by, and I'm going to kind of juggle my nodes around a little bit just to make it a little bit easier on myself. I want to define the roughness of the glossiness. The roughness is again how glossy or dull it is by the map that we already have. Now you can see we turned up the glossiness and it got quite shiny looking. That's okay, but you can still see shininess in these cracks. I don't want that, so I'm going to drag the color of the image texture and I'm going to define the roughness using that color of the image texture. So now what you can see is you're seeing a lot of glossiness here, and I'll make this full screen again in a moment so that you can kind of tell what's going on. In fact, I'll make it as big as I can on the screen right now. Inside of these grooves is no longer shiny, but the surface of all of the upper parts are shiny. Now perhaps this is too shiny for me, and so what I could do is I can adjust the mix shader right here so that it's not quite so shiny. I might want to turn this down. No, that goes the other way. That goes a lot shinier right there. I want to turn it up to make it less shiny. There we go. If I want to adjust in even more control what areas are shiny and dull, or I wanted to adjust, how glossy this is, in other words, the roughness level, what I can do is I can add another one of these multiply nodes. In fact, I'm just going to duplicate this node. So with this node selected, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drag it into the noodle between the image texture output and the roughness. Again, roughness is how, like a mirror or just sort of a dull reflectiveness, the texture is. So I'm going to drag that multiply in there, and I'll kind of adjust my nodes around so you can better see what's going on. There we go. And now I can adjust the factor. And what this will do is let me adjust it even more. As you can see, node setups can get quite complicated. This isn't even nearly as complicated as some of the ones that I've seen, but I hope that you are able to sort of follow along with this. Go ahead and try this for yourself. What I'll do in a minute is make this full screen, but I encourage you to try adding new things. The basic rule here is that the colored things go together. The only exception is, in other words, the inputs and outputs, blue to blue, green to green. The only exception is that yellow, which is a colored image or a colored material, and a gray input or output can be interchanged, because one is just expecting a black and white image, the other a color image. That's going to be it for this video. I'll leave this node set up on the screen as is. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.